There are several major developments in the Nolan Wells investigation tonight, and together they answer some questions while raising several new ones. For the first time since this case began, the FBI has publicly explained exactly why it became involved. At nearly the same time, one of Nolan's closest friends has spoken in greater detail about the hours surrounding the disappearance, offering his own account as public scrutiny continues to grow. Meanwhile, investigators are still waiting on key pieces of evidence that could shape where this case goes next. Those include pending autopsy findings, the examination of Nolan's phone, and the continuing review of witness statements. More than 2 weeks have passed since 18-year-old Nolan Wells disappeared during a trip to Horn Island, off Mississippi's Gulf Coast. What began as a desperate search quickly became one of the most closely followed investigations in the region. Thousands of people have watched every update, every interview, and every new piece of information, hoping that the next development would finally explain what happened during Nolan's final hours. Yet despite the attention, many of the biggest questions remain unanswered. One question in particular continued to fuel speculation across social media. Why was the FBI involved in what appeared to be a local investigation? For days, people offered their own explanations. Some believed federal agents had uncovered evidence pointing toward a larger criminal investigation. Others suggested the Bureau had quietly taken control of the case behind the scenes. Still others argued that the FBI's presence meant investigators already knew much more than they were willing to say publicly. According to the FBI's own statement, none of those assumptions accurately described its role. This week, the Bureau issued its clearest explanation so far. Officials said they have been assisting the Jackson County Sheriff's Office by providing federal resources, specialized tools, and investigative partnerships. They also made one point especially clear. Jackson County remains the lead agency and continues to direct the investigation. That clarification may sound simple, but it carries real importance. Federal agencies often assist local law enforcement without taking over an investigation. They can provide technical expertise, digital forensic support, and access to resources that smaller departments may not have available on their own. According to the FBI, that has been the arrangement from the beginning of this case. At first, that seemed straightforward. Then another detail stood out. The Bureau also confirmed that part of its work involves investigating interstate threats made against individuals connected to the Nolan Wells case. Officials did not identify who received those threats, nor did they describe their contents. Those details remain unclear. But by acknowledging that federal resources were being used to investigate threats crossing state lines, the FBI answered another question that had lingered for days. Their involvement was never limited to examining Nolan's death alone. It also included protecting people connected to the investigation. That distinction matters because it changes how many observers may interpret the Bureau's presence. Rather than signaling that federal agents had taken over the entire case, it suggests they were assisting in specific areas where federal jurisdiction applies. While the FBI addressed one mystery, another familiar voice entered the conversation. One of Nolan's friends, who has been mentioned repeatedly since the early days of the investigation, has continued speaking publicly about what happened that weekend. His account has attracted significant attention because he was among the last people known to have spent time with Nolan before everything changed. According to his statements, many assumptions circulating online simply do not match what he remembers experiencing. He has pushed back against rumors that spread rapidly after Nolan disappeared, including claims based on videos and photographs that later turned out to be misunderstood or taken out of context. In a case like this, those distinctions become incredibly important. A single photograph can appear convincing until investigators establish when it was actually taken. A short video clip may seem to show one thing until someone who was present explains what viewers are actually hearing. Investigators often have access to information the public does not, and that is one reason authorities continue urging patience while evidence is examined. Still, patience becomes difficult when families are waiting for answers. Nolan's parents have made it clear they intend to pursue every possible avenue in the search for the truth. Alongside law enforcement's investigation, they have also assembled their own independent team to review evidence and examine the timeline surrounding their son's disappearance. That independent effort has become another major part of this story. Rather than relying entirely on official updates, the family has worked with experienced investigators and legal representatives to ask additional questions, review available records, and press for a complete accounting of what happened. At the center of everything remains one simple timeline. Nolan spent the 4th of July weekend on Horn Island with friends. At some point during the day, he became separated from members of the group. Witnesses have described seeing him speak with another young person on the beach before they eventually went their separate ways. What happened during the period that followed remains one of the investigation's biggest unanswered questions. Records show search efforts intensified as Nolan could not be located, eventually leading to the heartbreaking discovery of his body days later. Since then, nearly every development has focused on filling in the gaps between those known events. Investigators continue reviewing electronic evidence. Witnesses continue providing statements. Experts are awaiting forensic findings. And each new detail is measured against the timeline already established. That would have been the end of it. But another detail stood out. The FBI's statement may have answered questions about federal involvement, yet it also reminded everyone just how many separate investigations are unfolding at once. Local detectives continue gathering evidence. Federal agents are addressing interstate threats. Independent investigators are reviewing information on behalf of Nolan's family. Prosecutors are preparing for whatever findings eventually emerge. All of those efforts are moving forward together, but not necessarily on the same schedule. For Nolan's family, every passing day feels significant. For investigators, each unanswered question demands careful verification before conclusions are reached. That balance between urgency and accuracy has shaped nearly every update in this case. And just as officials clarified the FBI's role, another conversation involving one of the people closest to Nolan began adding new context to his final hours. Context that could help investigators better understand the decisions made on Horn Island before Nolan disappeared. Whether those conversations ultimately answer the central question remains to be seen. But they are beginning to reshape how the final timeline may be understood. As investigators continued reviewing evidence, another development began drawing just as much attention as the FBI's statement. This one didn't come from a law enforcement agency. Instead, it centered on one of the last known conversations Nolan had before he disappeared. For days, much of what the public believed about that conversation came from second-hand accounts. Family members, friends, and social media posts all offered pieces of information, but they didn't always match one another. That left people wondering which version, if any, reflected what actually happened. Then, something unexpected happened. According to Nolan's mother, she met face-to-face with the young woman who reportedly spent time with Nolan on the beach during his final confirmed hours. Rather than hearing another account through relatives or online posts, she was finally able to hear directly from someone who had been there. That meeting has become one of the most closely discussed moments in the investigation. According to Nolan's mother, the young woman explained that she and Nolan talked on the beach before eventually going their separate ways. She believed Nolan intended to return to meet up with his own friends. That was the understanding she left with after their conversation. But another detail stood out. She reportedly never claimed that she actually watched Nolan board a boat or physically reunite with his group. Instead, she believed that was where he planned to go based on what he had told her. That may sound like a small difference, but investigators often pay close attention to distinctions like that. There is a significant difference between seeing someone do something and believing they intended to do it. One is direct observation. The other is an assumption based on a conversation. Those two things can easily become mixed together as a story spreads from one person to another. That is why investigators frequently return to original witnesses, asking them to describe exactly what they saw, exactly what they heard, and exactly when those events occurred. As simple as those questions may sound, the answers can shape an entire investigation. At first, many people believed there was a direct contradiction between this young woman's account and statements made by Nolan's friends. But after hearing the explanation more carefully, the situation appears more nuanced. If Nolan truly intended to return to his group, something may have happened after that conversation ended. Whether he changed his plans, became separated again, or encountered some other circumstance remains unclear. That gap in the timeline continues to be one of the investigation's biggest mysteries. According to public statements made by the family, that unanswered period is exactly why they continue pushing for every available piece of evidence to be examined. One item has received particular attention: Nolan's cell phone. Investigators believe the device could help establish movements, communications, and digital activity during the final hours before his disappearance. According to the family's legal representatives, the phone is expected to undergo careful examination alongside law enforcement's own review. Modern smartphones can preserve remarkable amounts of information: location history, call records, text messages, photos, application activity. Even small pieces of digital evidence sometimes help investigators establish a timeline with much greater precision than witness recollections alone. That does not mean the phone will answer every question. Sometimes devices are damaged, sometimes information is incomplete, sometimes evidence simply confirms what investigators already suspected. But in cases where witnesses remember events differently, electronic records can provide valuable context. That brings us to another important development. While the FBI confirmed it has been investigating interstate threats connected to this case, officials intentionally released very few details. According to reports, threats serious enough to involve federal resources were made against individuals connected to the investigation. Beyond that, authorities have remained cautious. That restraint is understandable. Law enforcement agencies rarely discuss active threat investigations publicly because doing so could complicate future criminal cases or expose the identities of people receiving protection. Unfortunately, the lack of detailed information has also allowed rumors to spread. Several reports circulating online have described graphic messages allegedly directed at people connected with Nolan's case. However, officials have not publicly confirmed the exact wording of those messages or identified everyone involved. That distinction deserves to be respected. There is an important difference between verified reporting and widespread online speculation. As this investigation continues, investigators appear determined to separate those two things. The same careful approach can also be seen in the medical side of the case. Two separate autopsies remain pending. The official state examination has not yet released its findings. An independent examination requested by Nolan's family is also continuing. Both reviews could provide additional answers about the circumstances surrounding Nolan's death. Until those reports are completed, many of the questions dominating public discussion simply cannot be answered with certainty. That has understandably been difficult for Nolan's family. Every day that passes without final medical findings is another day spent waiting for reports, waiting for investigators, waiting for evidence that may finally explain what happened to their son. Even so, they have continued appearing publicly, speaking with investigators, meeting with attorneys, and asking supporters to remain focused on facts rather than speculation. That message has become increasingly important. Over the past 2 weeks, Several widely shared claims have later been corrected. A photograph believed to show Nolan after the 4th of July was reportedly taken days earlier. A viral recording that many believed captured Nolan's voice was later identified by one of his friends as his own voice instead. Those examples illustrate how quickly misinformation can spread during a high-profile investigation. Once a claim gains momentum online, correcting it often proves much harder than sharing it in the first place. Investigators understand that challenge. So do families. Every inaccurate rumor has the potential to send attention in the wrong direction, while adding even more emotional strain to those already grieving. That is why officials continue asking the public to distinguish between what has been officially confirmed and what is still being reported or debated. As the investigation moves forward, another important legal milestone is beginning to take shape. According to statements from attorneys involved in the case, investigators are working toward eventually presenting evidence to a grand jury once the investigative process reaches that stage. What exactly that evidence will include, and whether it answers the many remaining questions, is something no one can yet say. But it does mean the investigation is entering a phase where every witness statement, every forensic report, and every piece of digital evidence may carry even greater significance. And as those pieces slowly come together, investigators are still trying to answer one question that has remained at the center of this case from the very beginning. What happened during the stretch of time after Nolan left that conversation on the beach, and before anyone realized he was missing? That missing chapter is still unwritten. It may ultimately be explained by forensic evidence. It may depend on digital records. Or it may come from someone who has not yet shared everything they know. For now, investigators continue following every lead, while Nolan's family continues waiting for the answers they have been seeking since the day he disappeared. As this investigation continues, one thing has become increasingly clear. There isn't just one process unfolding behind the scenes. Several investigations are moving forward at the same time, each with its own purpose, timeline, and standard of proof. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office remains responsible for leading the criminal investigation. According to the FBI, federal agents continue assisting where specialized resources are needed, particularly regarding interstate threats connected to people involved in the case. At the same time, Nolan's family has retained its own legal team and independent investigators to review evidence alongside law enforcement whenever possible. Each of those efforts is focused on the same goal: finding out exactly what happened to Nolan Wells. That sounds straightforward. In reality, it is anything but. Every witness statement has to be compared with physical evidence. Digital records have to be examined alongside timelines. Medical findings have to be reviewed carefully before investigators are willing to draw conclusions. Even something as simple as the exact time someone left one location and arrived at another can become critically important when reconstructing the final hours of a person's life. That is why cases like this often move more slowly than the public expects. Investigators are not only trying to discover what happened, they also have to make certain they can prove every conclusion they eventually reach. That brings us to another important legal step. According to attorneys representing Nolan's family, once investigators complete their work, the evidence is expected to be presented before a grand jury. Some viewers immediately interpreted that announcement as proof that criminal charges are coming. Legal experts, however, have urged caution. A grand jury is frequently used in cases involving suspicious or unexplained deaths. Its purpose is to review evidence presented by prosecutors and determine whether there is sufficient legal basis to move forward. Simply referring a case to a grand jury does not automatically mean investigators have concluded that a crime occurred, nor does it guarantee that charges will follow. Records show that process can take time. Investigators may continue gathering evidence even while preparing materials for prosecutors. Additional witness interviews, forensic testing, and expert analysis often continue Until officials are satisfied, they have assembled the clearest possible picture of events. For Nolan's family, though, those legal procedures exist alongside something much more personal. They are grieving the loss of an 18-year-old son. Throughout the investigation, they have repeatedly said their goal is not speculation or public arguments. They simply want answers supported by facts. That desire has resonated with thousands of people following the story across the country. Community members have attended prayer gatherings. Friends have shared memories of Nolan's kindness, his love of the outdoors, and the future he was beginning to build for himself. Former classmates, coaches, and neighbors have spoken about a young man whose life ended far too soon. It is easy, in the middle of an active investigation, to become consumed by timelines, interviews, and legal developments. Sometimes we forget there is a family living through every headline. For them, each news update is not simply another story. It is another reminder that the person they expected to see come home never did. As preparations were made for Nolan's funeral, that reality became impossible to ignore. Family members, friends, teammates, and members of the local community gathered not to debate evidence, but to celebrate the life of a young man remembered for his character and the relationships he built during his 18 years. Even as investigators continued their work behind the scenes, those closest to Nolan were forced to begin a different process, saying goodbye. It is one of the hardest moments any family can experience. Yet even during that period of mourning, they continued urging investigators to pursue every available lead and leave no question unanswered. That determination has become one of the defining features of this case. Looking back over the past several weeks, it is remarkable how much information has gradually become clearer. The FBI has now publicly explained why it became involved. Witness accounts have been clarified through direct conversations rather than second-hand reports. Investigators continue reviewing Nolan's cell phone alongside other physical and digital evidence. Autopsy findings remain pending. The legal process continues moving forward. Even with those developments, however, the central question has not changed. What happened after Nolan's final confirmed conversation on Horn Island? That missing stretch of time remains the key to understanding this case. Perhaps the answer will come from forensic evidence. Perhaps it will come from digital records. Perhaps another witness will remember something that seemed insignificant at the time but proves essential later. History has shown that important breakthroughs sometimes emerge weeks or even months after investigators begin putting individual pieces together. Until then, there are still gaps that only verified evidence can fill. For everyone following this investigation, that distinction remains important. Rumors may travel quickly. Social media theories may attract attention, but lasting answers almost always come from patient, investigative work, careful forensic analysis, and witnesses willing to speak truthfully about what they know. That is exactly what Nolan's family continues to hope for. As we close today's update, here is what we know. The FBI has confirmed its role in supporting the investigation, while emphasizing that the Jackson County Sheriff's Office remains in charge. Federal agents are investigating interstate threats connected to individuals involved in the case. Witnesses continue providing information that investigators are carefully comparing against physical evidence and digital records. Medical examinations are still underway. The family continues working alongside attorneys and independent investigators while waiting for the findings that may finally explain what happened. Every one of those developments brings investigators one step closer to understanding the full picture. Whether that picture ultimately confirms existing theories or reveals something entirely unexpected remains to be seen. We will continue following every verified development in the Nolan Wells investigation and bring you updates as new confirmed information becomes available. If you've been following this case with us, thank you for spending your time here today. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing so you don't miss future updates as investigators continue their work and more verified facts emerge. Until next time, thank you for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next update.